Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 8 of the Bad Eye Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew, the Archduke of annoying your racist uncle at Thanksgiving. But other people's racist uncles, like my uncles personally are great. I don't have any racist uncles in case, any of them are listening. I don't want to make it weird at the get-togethers. It's just me this week. We will be having more guests in the future, but I was too disorganized to arrange one for this week, which is fine because the thing I want to talk about is the thing that I have a fair amount to say about. So get ready to hear me yap about immigration and the general rise of fascism across the Western world for the next half hour or so. If you know me personally, you may know me as a purveyor of pro immigrant takes, both because I recognize the fundamental and immutable truth that all human beings have inherent value and dignity, and arbitrary factors like the geographic location of their birth should not determine where on the planet they have the right to live or the opportunities in life they have access to. But also, and I want to stress here, secondarily to that, but still very importantly, I love shawarma. I love it a lot. Burritos, I have unironically been mid burrito and thought how will I ever love another person the way that I love this burrito right now? Am I even capable of feeling this level of affection for another human being? And look, the answer is definitely yes. I was young, I'll admit it. I got a little lost in the burrito sauce. I'm just saying, my love for grilled and stewed meats wrapped in flatbreads genuinely cannot be overstated. Like recently, while I was on vacation in Asia, I was talking to my girlfriend about how much I miss home. I've been away for a few weeks at that point, and I was like, I miss my bed. I miss you. I miss tacos. And she laughed at me. She was like, "Oh, how romantic! Like I'm in the same category as tacos." And I told her, I don't think you understand how much I love tacos. Like, if you knew the number of people in my life that I have real, genuine affection for that are below tacos, like the totality of all the experiences I've had with them over a decade plus is genuinely less enjoyable to me than one meal of birria tacos. And that's not to take anything away from them. I love these people. I cherish them. I consider them good friends. I really like tacos. And if you knew that, I think you would feel differently. I think you would reevaluate your opinion. But before I make everyone in my life hate me by revealing what foods they are below on the scale of things that I love in life, let me just say that the reason that I brought that up is that food is one of the ways that people who are not immigrants and not the children of immigrants interact with immigrants and immigration most directly. It's one of the most obvious ways that we see immigrants impact our society positively. And to get serious now for a second, we've been seeing the demonization of immigrants and immigration across societies in the Western world for decades now. But in the last few years, it has gotten significantly worse in a way that is reminiscent of the periods immediately preceding some of the darkest parts of Western history. We are living in a time of extreme social and political precarity, the likes of which we have not seen in 100 years. And so, what I want to talk about today is the history of racism and anti immigrant rhetoric, where it came from, how it's connected to the dehumanization of other groups deemed undesirable, how that's connected to capitalism, and what the resurgence of that type of rhetoric today says about the growing fascist movement that we're seeing across the Western world. Because if you've been paying attention to what's been happening in the world these last few years, it should be clear to you that we are in danger of repeating some of the 20th century's worst mistakes. And I, for one, would hate to just sit here and watch our civilization fail an open book test. We know where this leads. It's almost like a lot of this stuff happened already and they pointedly taught us all about it very specifically in school and about how bad it was, specifically so that we would not repeat all those same mistakes again. And yet here we are, sig heiling again. We didn't even come up with a new salute. So let's get into it. My father's from Turkey. And there's a dark joke I've been making for years now about how Turks are kind of like the Mexicans of Europe. We're both kind of everywhere, and wherever we are, no one really totally wants us there, but wherever we go, all the people there fucking love our food. And I say that jokingly, but there is a dark truth to it. Like in the Western world, wherever you go, Canada, the US, Europe, Australia, if you're in a big city, you will find people who hate immigrants but love their food. And I think part of why that is that nobody in the West ever really makes a truly affirmative case for immigration. We talk about tolerance and intolerance without ever interrogating the appropriateness of the use of that word. Even people who are pro immigration talk about it as if it is something that needs to be justified, as if the natural state of the world is one where you, as a human being who was born in a place, have no right to live anywhere but that place. And the idea that you might move elsewhere in the world is not a right that you have fundamentally as a human being who was born on this planet. It is no different from any other human being born on this planet, but that instead, depending on where you go, it is a privilege to be granted to you by the people who already live there. And that is particularly true in the parts of the world where people have the most resources. As one of those people, I find that idea to be morally indefensible. The idea that I, by basically an accident of my birth, am entitled to access to opportunities that people who are no different from me are not entitled to simply because they were born on the wrong side of an arbitrary border is to me morally one of the worst and least defensible ideas in human history. And it's also not an idea that's that old. Passports as we know them were invented in the 1920s after World War I to secure borders and prevent people from moving from one place to another. Documents of citizenship resembling passports existed before that. There was an Ottoman passport, for example, created in the late 1800s that identified you as a citizen of the Ottoman Empire, and other empires and states around that time were issuing similar documents. But for most of history, borders were porous, and the only thing that stopped you from moving from one place to another was your physical ability to do so. If you could get there, generally, legally speaking, you could live there. There were certainly exceptions. Japan famously closed its borders for hundreds of years and didn't, in theory at least, allow anyone in or out until it was forced to accept trade with the outside world by the US in 1853. Although there are many documented records of people entering and leaving Japan during that time because it has always been impossible to keep anyone out of anywhere. But for the most part, for the vast majority of human history, the main constraints on immigration from one place to another were material. People simply couldn't physically get there. There were few legal constraints on the free movement of people from one part of the world to another, and the ones that did exist were difficult to enforce. So, how do we get from that world to the world we live in today, where we're all effectively playing a lottery from birth, where some of us win and are born in resource rich countries, which ironically have passports that afford us even more freedom of movement to be able to go to other resource rich countries with relative ease? And most of us lose and are born in countries with fewer resources and therefore fewer opportunities, and who on top of that have their movements restricted in order to prevent them from moving to more opportunity rich places. Now, look, the answer to that question is obviously complicated, but if you guessed capitalism, you're not entirely wrong. It's not an accident that rich countries tend to have more powerful passports and poor countries tend to have weak ones. Anti-immigration conservatives in Western countries often make that argument explicitly that immigrants from poor countries will come to our rich country and take our jobs and abuse our social services. And the subtext of that is that the wealth of our rich country, which has definitely been earned and is deserved, and for sure did not come from one or several historic, horrific crimes that we're just not going to talk about, is going to go to these undeserving undesirables who shouldn't get to benefit from it because they were born in the bad place that I don't like, unlike me, who was born in the good place that I do like. And that's why my life should be good and their lives should be bad. And that's kind of base and obvious to people. It's clear how a system of global capitalism where the only value of human life is its ability to produce profit could give rise to an argument like that. But I think what's less obvious to people is the ways that all anti immigration arguments in the modern era have their roots in that system of capitalism. Because that one is explicitly about resources, and it's obvious how that serves the interests of capital. Restricting the free movement of people and making it difficult to get to places where opportunity is plentiful artificially creates a state of desperation to get into those resource rich countries, which benefits capital directly as it can then exploit those people's labor more cheaply, and they have less recourse to do anything about it. But it's less obvious how the other arguments are. Because the other main way that people make the case against allowing unrestricted immigration is about culture and values. They'll say that foreign cultures are incompatible with our local culture and that allowing unrestricted immigration to a given country will negatively affect the local culture, will suppress or supplant it. Or in some cases, that the values held by people from other cultures are fundamentally incompatible with our local values. We see these arguments throughout the world. They're not restricted to the West, and they have kind of local flavors wherever they pop up. But setting aside that that's not really how culture works, because culture always fundamentally evolves, the ideas themselves are fundamentally arguments premised on the idea of preserving the purity of a culture and a population, and by extension, premised on the idea of the supremacy of that culture. Now, look, some people may take issue with me framing it that way, and I understand why. That particular word has a lot of connotations, but the idea that a culture or a population is better off without external influence is supremacy by definition. Because the argument that you're effectively making is that that external influence would negatively impact the culture of the population. And that can only be true if the unadulterated culture is at least subjectively superior to the ones being added in. And that's why in the West, we most often see this discourse framed this way when we're talking about immigration from countries that are either Muslim or African or both. Because in the West, our local flavor of supremacy is white supremacy, which, historically the most successful flavor. You might even say it's the vanilla of supremacies. Ironically, like vanilla, the thing that gives white supremacy its flavor is also brown. Because in the Western context, these culture and value based arguments are really proxies for race. And the entire modern construction of race is a direct result of colonialism, which is itself a system that's inextricably linked to capitalism. Now, look, humans have always categorized themselves in groups. And when we discuss the way that humans have historically identified which people are members of their groups and which are not, we tend to use the language of race because that is how we categorize ourselves in the modern era. We talk about like white Greeks and Romans and black Egyptians and other Africans, but the modern concept of race as it exists in our social structures today can be traced back to Europe and evolved over the course of 300 or so years from the 1500s to the 1800s as Europeans left their continent and came in contact with people who were visibly phenotypically different than them. Race as we know it was created as a tool by Europeans to justify the exploitation, enslavement, and genocide of Africans, Asians, and indigenous Americans and Australians. It assigned groups of people that had almost nothing in common with each other ethnically, linguistically, or culturally into broad categories and created a hierarchy of those categories where only the privileged group, only white people, are afforded full personhood. They did this effectively to circumvent their own morality and human empathy because it's actually unnatural to treat other human beings who you see as fully equal to you in the ways that European colonialism demanded that people outside of the dominant group be treated. But what's important to know about this system and what's relevant to us today is that the supremacy was created as a justification for the exploitation, not the other way around. We know this because prior to the age of colonialism, Europeans had no concept of themselves or other peoples as grouped into races in the way we think of them today. Like I said, humans have always categorized each other, and those categorizations have sometimes superficially resembled our modern conception of race, but they differed in some key ways. The Greek historian Herodotus, for example, did categorize many groups of people of his era together in categories that we often in modern translations of his writings call race, but these races were really ethnic and linguistic groups. They were almost all united by either a common culture, language, or both, which is something that was true of almost all pre colonial systems categorizing people across the world. This is different than our modern concept of white people, black people, Asians, etc. Irish Celts, Russians, and Hungarians are all technically white people, at least in the system of racial categorization that exists today in the Western world. But those three groups of people have very little in common ethnically, linguistically, or culturally. The same is true of Khoisan people, Wolof people, and Tigrayan people, who are separated by thousands of kilometers, speak unrelated languages, and practice different religions, but would all be considered black. Humans have also always exploited each other. Slavery, forced labor, economic exploitation, and genocide were not invented during the age of colonialism. Even supremacy predates our modern conception of race. The Greeks thought that their civilization was the best and most sophisticated in all the world, as did the Romans, as did the Egyptians, as did the Persians, as did the Chinese. All of these people thought their culture and language were superior to those of the people around them. But what differentiates that supremacy from white supremacy is that you could become Roman by becoming a Roman citizen and learning Latin. You could become Egyptian by adopting their language and culture. None of these supremacies were based on anything innate or immutable at the individual level. That is what makes our modern conception of race, our hierarchy of white supremacy, and the system of European colonialism unique. Groups can move in and out of whiteness. We see this with Irish people in the United States, for example, but individuals crucially cannot. And the reason this system of white supremacy was created at the particular moment in history that it was that it became necessary to justify exploitation on a much larger scale than had historically been practiced. As European empires grew, and particularly as they established colonies in the New World and later in Africa, Asia, and Oceania, the explicit purpose of which was the extraction of resources from the colony to enrich the colonial power, they needed more and more labor. But their populations were not so large that they could export large numbers of people to do that labor and still have enough people to sustain their local economies and grow food back home. They also are not at this point in history wealthy enough yet to pay the people already in those colonies to do the labor themselves. They didn't have nearly as much valuable stuff. That's why they needed the colonies in the first place. So that leaves them with really one way to enrich themselves, and that's to force people to do the labor. Now, as I said before, slavery existed throughout the world long before the age of European colonialism, but enslaving enough people to form an entire labor force for a colony was unheard of. The Romans, the Chinese, the Egyptians, the Aztecs, and various other groups had slavery as a concept, but slaves in those societies were almost always captured during war. They were war captives and only ever supplemented an existing peasant workforce of local people. They weren't doing all, or even the lion's share of the economically productive work the way that slaves did in colonies that grew cash crops. For that to work, you need many, many more slaves, far more than could be captured during any given war, and you needed a consistent supply of slaves, but no power could afford an endless war. You need a pool of people who are fair game to enslave, whether you were at war with them or not. You needed a justification for keeping that many people enslaved for their entire lives, and for enslaving their descendants so that this labor pool becomes self-sustaining, and none of these were typical features of the pre-colonial era systems of slavery throughout the world. The system of white supremacy provides all of that. By creating a hierarchy where all non Europeans exist on kind of a sliding scale of partial personhood, it provided a justification for enslaving Africans en masse, abducting them from their homes, and keeping both them and their descendants enslaved generation after generation. It also provided a justification for the expropriation of lands from indigenous Americans and Australians by presenting those populations as inherently uncivilized and therefore unworthy stewards of their own land, conveniently allowing for Europeans to swoop in and use that land for their own purposes. But the relationship between white supremacy and capitalism is laid most bare when examining who white Europeans have historically considered members of their own group. The British, for example, denied the Irish whiteness for hundreds of years, and even insisted that they were phenotypically completely different despite looking exactly the same. Because the British were resource rich colonial overlords, and the Irish were a comparatively poor colony. The rich Germans considered the poor Italians and Slavs not to be white, despite the very thin line between a German face and a Polish face to a non white observer. And that's a dynamic that still exists in Europe today, despite all three of these groups having fully assimilated into whiteness. And most crucially, when the economic circumstances of all those groups were equalized in the New World, in places like America and Canada, groups that were considered non white in Europe, like the Irish and the Italians and the Poles, were able to buy their way into whiteness by aligning themselves with capital and the existing power structure against black and other non white populations that existed in those territories. Anti-immigrant rhetoric or anti-outgroup rhetoric, really, because you'll notice that the people who use anti-immigrant rhetoric have the same opinions of the people in question, whether they're immigrating or not, is fundamentally an expression of alignment with the existing power structure and therefore with capital. Whether it's by the British about the Irish in the 1800s, by the Germans about the Jews and Slavs in the 1900s, by Americans about Mexicans and Arabs in the 2010s, or by Canadians about Indians in the 2020s. That's right, Canada. We're calling it out. But if you want further examples, we can examine another unfortunate outgrowth of the intellectual legacy of colonial era supremacy: eugenics. Eugenics is the idea of encouraging or discouraging the reproduction of individuals in order to increase the instance of heritable characteristics deemed desirable in the overall population, which sounds okay for like 2 seconds until you start asking questions about who gets to decide which heritable characteristics are desirable and which ones aren't. Eugenics in the 21st century is pretty commonly understood to be bad. I think for most people, the word eugenics conjures up images of like 18th century racist pseudoscientists measuring cranial widths with calipers. But while eugenics is historically tied to white supremacy, and many white supremacists certainly considered non European origin to be an undesirable heritable trait, eugenics differs from white supremacy in that the axes of discrimination of eugenics as an ideology extend beyond the limits of what we would consider race. And the other common target of eugenicists, or the other and arguably the main groups of people who eugenics as an ideology sought to eliminate, were people with disabilities. 18th century eugenicists were obsessed with preventing disabled people from reproducing. They were obsessed with perfecting humanity, quote unquote, and saw people with disabilities as active pollutants to the gene pool. They advocated for and pursued policies of forced confinement in places like asylums, forced sterilization, and even euthanasia. This was an ideology that was very popular throughout the Western world, particularly in the United States. But the culmination of this ideology, where it found its most successful and horrifying expression, was with the murder of more than 200,000 disabled people during the Holocaust by the Nazis, in a program that would later become the model for the larger scale killings of Jews and Roma based on race and ethnicity. And in eugenics, even more clearly than in white supremacy, it is very obvious that at the intellectual foundation of this ideology, there is a fundamentally capitalist ethos. Because the reason that eugenicists saw disabilities as undesirable traits in the first place is because in many cases, disabilities diminish or restrict an individual's ability to be economically productive. And the fundamental idea of capitalism is that the value of a human life is not innate value. It lies in that person's productive potential and their ability to perform labor and therefore generate profit. And any physical or mental condition that impairs or restricts that diminishes the value in real terms of that life. This ethos is reflected directly in their arguments. The Nazis justified their killing of disabled people by calling them a drain on society, a waste of resources that would otherwise go to hardworking German citizens. Does that phrasing sound familiar to anyone? Because I'm pretty sure I've heard it before. Which brings me to the real reason I've been talking about this. We talked about the roots of these ideologies, but now I want to talk about the ways in which they're resurgent today. Because we all know the Nazis are back, but I don't think people in general fully grasp how back they are. Because this isn't some evolution of an ideology that has been adapted for the modern era. This is straight up the same shit on a different day. And it would be tempting to make this all about Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and some of it definitely is, but if we want to talk honestly about this, we have to cast a wider net. We need to talk about the ways that supremacist rhetoric, both racial and otherwise, has been baked into our culture this entire time. We need to talk about how that same rhetoric never really went away. It just changed targets. How we have always had classes of people we deem undesirable, both within and outside of our societies, this entire time. Because the core of the original Nazi ideology that they inherited from their ideological ancestors, colonial era white supremacists, was that there are certain types of people that are not fully people. And because they're not fully people, they're disposable. And that idea should strike you as familiar, even if you didn't just finish listening to me explain some of the historical ways that it came about. You'll have heard it on the news when we talk about foreign wars, when we talk about our own soldiers sent abroad to kill people as full human beings. We talk about the implications on their mental health. We worry about their well being. And to be clear, we should see them as full human beings. They are full human beings. But at the same time, we won't even talk about the people they kill in the active voice. 50 people were killed in Beirut on Tuesday, but the Taliban killed 10 soldiers in Kabul. You'll have heard it on the news throughout the pandemic when we described the lowest paid jobs that we have as essential and forced those people to work without paying them any extra money at great risk to their own lives. When we refuse to adopt and persist with common sense protective measures because only the sick and elderly would die. When we still refuse to take those common sense measures, despite the fact that it means that a great number of disabled people who are immunocompromised are now effectively barred from public life because people don't want to wear masks at the grocery store during flu season. Right now, in Canada, we have a program of legalized medically assisted suicide that is being used disproportionately by disabled people who do not need to die. And I say that as someone who actually supports people's right to end their lives, but most of the people availing themselves of this program are doing it because they cannot access the supports necessary for them to live, not because their lives are genuinely so inherently intolerable that they're not worth living. And offering a program like that without offering them the kind of comprehensive social supports for disabled people that would prevent so many of them from taking advantage of it is another example of the supremacist streak that runs through our culture. That we view these people as simply disposable, and we cannot conceive of a world where their lives would be worth living. Now, look, I'm not saying that everyone who says or believes or supports those things is a Nazi. That would be hyperbolic even for me. The point that I'm trying to make is that the hyper individualist streak that runs through our collective Western culture, the one that allows people to believe in the concept of a self made billionaire, the one that allows people to find it acceptable that homeless people just be left to die in the wintertime because it's somehow their fault that they cannot afford shelter. That streak is the same animus that led to the Nazi ideology becoming what it became, that leads all fascist movements to becoming what they ultimately become. The refusal to acknowledge or accept the inherent human dignity of your fellow human beings, or even of yourself, to have the idea that a good life with dignity and joy and some measure of happiness is not a right that should be guaranteed to every human, and that the aim of society should be to try and ensure that every human life is that way, but instead that those are privileges to be earned, that idea is the same idea that allows for the dehumanization of any group. And when that idea no longer serves its purpose, the age of colonialism is over, and it is no longer acceptable to society to openly enslave people. And that's what that idea was created for. That's what the purpose of it intellectually was. And when that idea no longer serves its purpose, it metastasizes into a bitter resentment. And that's what makes people susceptible to the rhetoric of demagogues like Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and Alice Weidel. These people prey on the aggrieved feelings of a population that was raised on this supremacist rhetoric, but is incapable of being honest with itself about the fact that it is supremacist, incapable of expressing its own core beliefs openly, because Western culture as a whole has not fully reckoned with how fundamentally it is based on the supremacist ideas created to justify European colonialism. We have never really fully dealt with the fact that all of that stuff is baked directly into our culture. And that's how you end up with so many people who are so angry that they will willingly surrender their own rights just to punish people that they see as beneath them. A significant number of Americans right now do not believe that immigrants in their country who are there in an ever expanding list of quote unquote illegal circumstances are entitled to due process. The most fundamental right enshrined in their laws, their constitution, that they cherish and hold above almost anything, without understanding that the tools the state is using to persecute those people will ultimately be turned on them, because their own unexamined supremacy makes them utterly incapable of even considering that there might not be a difference between those people and them. And so, if we want to fight fascism, I say we start there. Let's start by interrogating those beliefs and challenging that supremacy. Let's start by insisting that people acknowledge that nobody in any society does anything alone, insisting that everyone, regardless of where they're from, deserves human dignity, deserves respect, deserves a good life, regardless of how hard they can work, regardless of how hard they want to work. Because we are all more than where we came from. We're more than what we can produce. We are more than all the profits we can generate. And until we accept that, we will all eventually find ourselves disposable. And with that, I think we'll call it here for this week. I know this was a short one. We're experimenting a bit with the format, but it took me a while to write this because I wanted to put out something that I was happy with. And I've got a lot going on in my personal life and just with my job. So we will probably be touching on these topics again in the future. I definitely have a lot more to say about the general rise of fascism and everything that's going on. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the actual current events of it, the specific details of it. But I was struggling a bit with how best to communicate that and also provide the historical context. And I still wanted to give you something this week. So this is what you get. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And we'll be back next week, maybe with more on this topic. Maybe we'll circle back to it after we do something else. We will be moving to weekday releases going forward. It's just easier that way. It frees up my weeknights a little bit so that I can write and edit more on the weekend. With that last little bit of housekeeping out of the way, this week's recommendation is the song Wish I Didn't Miss You by Angie Stone, because I've been bumping it all week. It's a catchy 90s R&B classic from a legend who passed away about a month ago. Far too soon, I might add. I can't play the song for you for licensing reasons because I don't want this podcast to be taken down off any platforms, but I highly recommend that you check out the song and listen to it and listen to the rest of her music while you're at it, because she is a huge legend of 90s R&B that I honestly did not know about until I discovered this song a few days ago, and I cannot get it out of my head. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing, liking, hitting that notification bell, giving us 5 stars, sharing it with your friends, buying a billboard in Times Square with your face on it to play a video message about how awesome I am. Really any way that you can support the show would be greatly appreciated. And if you've got anything you'd be interested in hearing us talk about, any topics that you'd want to hear covered on the show, please do shoot us an email at submissions@badeyepodcast.com. That's the word submissions at bad, BADIEYE, podcast, podcast.com. Lastly, a huge thank you, as usual, to Saz Jazz Paris for allowing us to use this music. I'll be back next week with another topic. Be easy, y'all.